In Feras speak, this means hello.
Welcome Zilly, which means it's going down.
So there's an old saying, which is that we hate to see you go,
but happy that...
We hate to see you go.
No, hate to see you leave.
But love to watch you go.
I'm saying hate to see you leave. Yeah.
Exactly. And in any case,
let's be nice. Okay, we share a complicated relationship with Feras, and obviously I'm the good cop.
And you could say that I'm the bad one, but Feras is really like my evil twin and the worst of us all. So essentially, they say keep your friends close and your enemies closest.
That's
so
exactly
I feel like, Feras and I are like the best of friends in this sense.
We should get back to the introduction now. So Feras El Zarwi's research focuses on teaching the program Arabic slang, and when he has more time, on behavior modeling. Honestly, I learned more conversational Arabic from Feras in 3 years than 4 years of formal learning. So it speaks a lot about his ability.
So Feras is doing a PhD in transportation engineering here at UC Berkeley. Before that, as part of the Lebanese mafia, he was doing his bachelor's at AUB, like everyone else. And then he came here afterwards and did a master's in transportation engineering.
Before joining the PhD program at UC Berkeley, he worked as a transportation consultant at SETS International in the Middle East region for 2 years, so lots of money. We still get some free lessons on consulting and the business world for free, so how lucky of us.
In consulting, Feras worked on network optimization, traffic impact studies, transportation planning, which he hated, and doing feasibility and financial evaluations for many projects, including things like the Beyond Metro.
I still remember my first interaction with Feras in Stat 215A among the panic mode and the palpitations, and I'm so happy to see him grow into this young, confident man doing phenomenal research and giving us this presentation. So we're excited to introduce Feras and say hi to his parents and his brother who are watching us live.
And one other thing is that we've given you the formal bio to share, I guess, real facts about Feras. We once went camping, and it was Feras, Street, and myself. This is when I learned that really Feras hates everything, like birds, nature, stars, anything at all. Just about the only things that we found out that he did like were his parents, his brothers, for all of you watching, his little cousin Raina, who can do linear regression in Excel, and Shrita, and discrete choice modeling, just about these things. On this last bit, we will hear more about it now.
Yeah.
So join us in giving a round of applause.
Thank you guys for this intro, and thank you everyone for showing up today. I'm super excited to be here, to be discussing my research projects throughout this journey of the PhD for the last 3 years. General outline for my talk, I'm going to start first by defining the motivation for all of the work that I was doing throughout my dissertation, and then punching out the objectives of my dissertation, and then we will go into more detail with one of the projects in my dissertation that focuses on dynamics of lifestyles and travel behavior. And then if we have some time, I'm going to briefly discuss the fourth bullet point here, the adoption and diffusion of new transportation services, the other project that I worked on, and finally conclusions and key takeaways from this dissertation. Transformative mobility. I mean, it's everywhere, it's happening. I mean, how many times a day do we come across the following terms or the following transformative technologies and services? Ride sharing, Uber and Lyft, the envisioned sharing economy future that everyone is talking about, autonomous vehicles, the Riyadh Metro project for those of you from the Middle East, or even the high-speed rail project in California. Investments in infrastructure are happening, whether they're happening now, and more investments are bound to occur in the future. And we all are talking about this envisioned sharing economy future. This future encourages multimodality, sustainability, improves the quality of life, attains economic vitality, and finally it ensures connectivity within the system. And it's all over the literature now. It suggests that even under the most optimistic scenarios, the environmental goals of society cannot be met by operations, system, and technology improvements only. We need to cater for behavior change. And what is it about behavior change that we should be focusing on in this era of transformative mobility? We should make sure that we have sustainable and multimodal transitions of trends of travel behavior. We want to make sure that those trends walk in the right direction so that we can get to this future that we're all talking about. How can we get there? we need policies. We need to define quantitative methods that entail a policy evaluation framework. And that framework would focus on modeling the evolution of those trends of travel behavior. It tries to understand how would people react in response to those technologies and services so that we can prioritize and rank effective policies that would get us to that future that we're talking about. And finally, a key idea in this era of transformative mobility is the concept of dynamics. And the fact that the choice set and the travel choices are changing so drastically over time by perturbing the system, including more options, more choices for travelers. The whole idea that the literature is talking about, the way we should start thinking of travel behavior, it should be more of a dynamic nature. It's no longer the static framework that focuses on cross-sectional data at a certain time period. We should start looking at travel behavior in a dynamic manner. Great, so we've identified that we care about trends. Trends are important, dynamics are important. Now when we go and see what's happening in the transportation consulting world, the mechanism or the commonly used approach that consultants use to project market shares of transportation into the future are the activity-based travel demand models. However, there are two key limitations for those models in terms of capturing trends of travel behavior, and we will talk about them. First is there is no mechanism in those activity-based models that cater for the diffusion, uptake, or decline of the new technologies. For example, Uber, Lyft, so that Tim is happy, Zipcar, and autonomous vehicles. The second thing is, when we look at those models, they're estimated using cross-sectional data. They have a static framework. So they lack a dynamic framework that could model and forecast changes in lifestyles, travel behavior, and transport modality styles. And when we look at those two key limitations of the current methods, this to us defines the basis of my dissertation. I'm trying to address those two key limitations in my dissertation. So what are my objectives in this dissertation? One is to develop a disaggregated dynamic discrete choice model to understand and predict long-range trends in travel behavior. One, trends of lifestyle and transport modality styles and how they evolve over time, and trends of technology and service adoption. In this talk, as I said earlier, I will focus mainly on the first topic, which is trends of lifestyles and transport modality styles. And then if we have some time, we'll discuss the second project. And the other two key objectives are to test the proposed framework, to assess its methodological flexibility and robustness, and finally to empirically highlight the value of the framework in transportation policy and practice. Now, the first piece of work in my dissertation is again modeling and forecasting the evolution of lifestyles and travel behavior. The objective is to develop a dynamic behavioral framework for modeling the evolution of lifestyles and trends of travel behavior as a function of changes in the built environment or the transportation system, and as a function of changes in social demographic variables. And why, to us, that's important, because we want to understand how would the future look like when we have policies and investment strategies happening. And to us, we believe that this might actually improve the accuracy for long-range forecasting. When building our methodological framework, there are three different constructs we should come across before we identify the type of model that we need to focus on and its specification. First, trends of travel behavior to guide transformative mobility. Second, modality styles and why is it important to us, and their dynamic evolution over time. And finally, what are the different dynamic models out there and which model is most suitable to our objective. Again, back to future of transformative mobility. I mean, everything is happening, the system is changing. The future of this transformative mobility trend can play in heaven or hell scenarios and anywhere in between. We can either have a future where it's connected, where it's autonomous, we have fewer cars off the road, or we can have zero occupancy autonomous vehicles running around and having more congestion in the system. Or the heaven scenario would be people using ride-sharing and car-sharing apps rather than, for example, buying autonomous vehicles and increasing the auto ownership levels. And again, we want to have a future that focuses on ride-sharing more than having one individual in the car. We want to have as many individuals as we can in cars in order to reduce number of cars on the roads. And finally, ideally, we'd want to have a reduction in the vehicle miles traveled. And that's the heaven scenario that we were talking about, and that's the hell scenario. And then, how can we get to this heaven scenario? Again, as we talked about earlier, we need policies and investment strategies, whether at the public level or at the transportation network company levels, to influence and guide the evolution of trends of travel behavior. For example, policies could be parking regulations, congestion pricing, or marketing campaigns, where it could be the cool new trend now to be part of this car sharing, ride sharing economy. And why would you assume that trends might change? Why would trends of travel behavior change over time? They could change because the system is changing, the transportation system is changing, we have a new mode of transportation out there, changes in social demographic variables, or even changes in social norms and the way people look at things now, what is acceptable and what is not. Now, that is why when we look at these things, I mean, trends are important, their dynamics are important, policies and investment strategies are important. To us, we need to start understanding, I mean, what is it that we should start focusing on? What is the key construct that I should focus on in modeling the system? And this is where this construct of at the higher level orientations of or lifestyles kicks in, because a person usually makes a decision about a certain lifestyle he wants to adopt, which will dictate the certain travel decisions and activity decisions that he will make. And that construct is the modality style construct. And the modality styles they refer to as the lifestyles built around the particular use of certain travel mode or travel modes. The idea here is that people are different. There's heterogeneity all across the population. Modality styles try to identify discrete market segments in the population that differ in two different things. They differ in their choice set and their day heterogeneity. If we take a look at the Venn diagram on the left, we can see the different alternatives that a certain person can consider when going from a certain origin to a certain destination. I mean, there are people that will drive no matter what. I don't like taking public transportation, for example. There are people that like to take bus no matter what. And again, there are people that could fit in with different combinations on this Venn diagram. And that's where the construct of modality style tries to map this out. Yes, people are different. Some of them will consider different subsets, and their sensitivity to travel time and travel cost is different across the different market segments. So great, we've identified that modality style is a key concept. Now, what about dynamics of modality styles? Why should we care about modeling the dynamics of modality styles over time? I would have three small Toy Story problems to motivate why dynamics are important. Let's take, for example, the case that a certain individual has three alternatives in his choice set. He has car, bike, and bus, and he wants to make a choice decision about going to work. And we're looking at two different time periods. We have time period T and time period T plus 1, and we have two different modality styles out there in the population. We have the driver's class that entails only the car as an alternative in the choice set, and the multimodal user, where the user could consider the three different modes to make the choice decision. And then that person gets out of college, is making more money, has a higher income, and wouldn't we expect a higher transition from the multimodal user class to the driver class? If so, what is the ratio? What's going to happen there? Are we going to have more users transitioning, or are habits and inertia so big that no, this multimodal class is just going to stay there? Similar thing, if we have an investment in the infrastructure itself, let's say we have a new metro system like the Paris Metro, for example. It's cost effective and it's reduction in travel time. I can get to my job in a reasonable amount of money and time. And now the metro is there, and now in this multimodal user class, now this alternative is in the choice set. So would we assume that we have more transitions of drivers to the multimodal user class? Or again, are we going to have drivers resisting that new metro, and then you just want to keep drive for the sake of driving? And again, the last Toy Story here is again ride sharing or autonomous vehicles. They're there. Are we going to have them in the choice set for drivers and multimodal users? And if that's the case, how are the transitions going to happen? Are we going to have more drivers shifting to becoming more multimodal users or not? And what about the multimodal users? And again, this is where the concept of the dynamics and the shifts or modality styles are important in our framework. And finally, now that we've identified that dynamics are important, let's identify the three commonly used dynamic discrete choice models in the literature, and we will punch out and identify the model that is more suitable to our framework. We first have the common basic dynamic choice models. We observe a certain person over time, we track his choices over time, there could be some panel effect happening there, and that's it. There's another set of dynamic choice models that we refer to as the optimal stopping problem, and they're famous in operations research. And the whole idea is when a person buys a durable good, which is a good that yields utility over time, let's say a car or an electric vehicle, the idea is that a person at a certain time period is forward-looking. He looks forward into the future about the way he will use the car. And then he will discount the utility from the car and makes a choice decision currently. I mean, am I going to buy the car now, or I'm going to postpone the purchase of the car into the future? And the third class of dynamic models we refer to as the hidden Markov models, and they're famous. They're from the machine learning world. And the whole idea is here, again, we do have choices happening over time. We have a panel, observations happening over time for the person, but we do have a hidden state. We do have a hidden layer that impacts the choice situation that a person makes over time. Great. If we take a step back, we are interested in modeling the dynamics of modality styles. Modality styles, they're lifestyles we don't observe. So if we put the two pieces together, great, those lifestyles, they impact my choice. So that's to us where the hidden Markov model is the most suitable dynamic model, because it has this hidden layer of modality styles or lifestyles that we can have, and then we can observe the mode choice or the choice that the person makes at a certain time period. To make things clear, this is what the hidden Markov model framework would look like. Of course, it entails two different layers. The first layer is a first order Markov chain, and where we have different modality styles happening at different transitions of modality styles happening over time. And the key assumption here is that a modality style at a certain time period is only a function of the modality style at the previous time period. And then if we go down to the next level, we observe the mode choice vector of choices for a certain person at a certain time period. And the assumption is that a person is myopic. The only thing, this mode choice decision that is happening is a function of the modality style at that time period. And those are the two key assumptions in hidden Markov models. And again, the modality styles, their lifestyles, they're unobserved. We try to infer that the mode choice is the thing that I can only observe. The modality styles, we put them in ellipses and in rectangles, the mode choice, because we observe them. Great. There are three different subcomponents in hidden Markov models that we should come across first and talk about their specification before we start estimating the model. There's a class-specific choice model, the initialization model, and the transition probability model. The class-specific choice model, as we said earlier, it tries to understand how does a person make a certain vector of choices conditioned on being in a certain modality style at that time period. And this is where we're trying to blend and fuse the machine learning world with our discrete choice and econometrics world. Because to us, we care about a model being theoretically grounded, statistically interpretable. We can look at results and interpret them, and it should be behaviorally consistent. So the behavior, the econometrics, we want to blend those two worlds together. And this is where the discrete choice modeling component is critical to us. And second, the initialization model. The initialization model tries to assign individuals to the different modality styles at the first time period 1. And the transition probability model tries to model the transition of modality styles over time. So let's say I'm in a driver's class now, what's my probability of transitioning into being a multimodal user person in the future time period? Now let's focus more on the specification of those three different submodels. If we take a look at the diagram on the right, so we're focusing on a certain time period t, and again, we're observing the mode choice for that person over time, and then we have this utility for the different alternatives for that person, and then we're trying to understand the probability of observing the vector of choices for that person as a function of the level of service attributes. Travel time, travel cost, walking time, number of transfers, so on and so forth, and they're all conditioned on belonging to that modality style at that time period. In other words, we're trying to compute the probability of observing a vector of choices for individual n across capital T time periods, because we're observing the process for capital T time periods, conditioned on that the individual belongs to a certain sequence of modality styles, because that person could transition. Here we're just conditioning on a certain sequence of states, and the way we can compute it is we calculate the probability that a person makes a choice decision at a certain wave t or time period t and choice situation k. He chooses alternative j, conditioned on the fact that the individual belongs to a certain modality style s during that wave. We loop over all alternatives, over all choice situations, and over all time periods, and we can get that probability. Great. And again, all of these probabilities, they're rooted in discrete choice theory. Fantastic. Now, we can move to the initialization model. And again, the initialization model, we are basically assigning individuals to different modality styles during the first time period. And here we're assigning the probability of belonging to different modality styles at the first time period is a function of the socioeconomic and demographic variables: age, gender, level of education, level of income, so on and so forth. And the third component, which is the transition probability model, it tries to understand the probability of transitioning from one modality style to the other over time. And it's going to be a function of socioeconomic and demographic variables. And again, we're interested in figuring out how will modality styles change over time? For example, if we introduce a metro, like the Paris metro, a new mode of transportation, ride sharing, what's going to happen? So we also want to quantify the impact of the level of the transportation system on those transitions. And again, we're trying to model, as we said earlier, the transition across modality styles over time. And if we take a step back earlier, the whole objective behind this project was to understand, to model, and to forecast the evolution of modality styles. And we ended up using the homogeneous hidden Markov model, which is common in the machine learning world. The whole idea is that I need my parameter estimate. I need some sort of parameter estimate that I want to use to forecast. So our parameter estimates in the transition probability model will be time independent, so that once they're estimated from the data, the panel data itself, I can use it to forecast. Now, putting all of the three submodels in place, this would be the complete hidden Markov model framework that is rooted in discrete choice theory. Again, as we can see, that's the transition probability model and the class-specific choice model. And the initialization model happens at time period t plus 1. And this is for time period t and time period t plus 1. Great. So now in order to estimate our model, we need to define our likelihood function. We're going to maximize that likelihood function and get our parameter estimates. Our likelihood function will be the class-specific choice model we saw earlier. The probability of a vector of choice is conditioned on a sequence of states. We'll multiply that by the sequence of states, assuming that this is a first-order Markov chain. We sum across all different states over time, and then we take the product over all individuals, and then we maximize that likelihood function to get our parameter estimates. Now, so the data that we were estimating our model on comes from Santiago, Chile. So Santiago had a privately operating system of buses that had an inefficient fleet, small headways, and high frequencies at congested spines. And the metro had a low market share, which comprised 8% of city strips. A group of consultants met up, and they wanted to because the whole idea was that they want to increase the market share of the metro. And there was a complete redesign of the transit system, which they denoted as Trans Santiago, that was implemented overnight. And then the bus system no longer, they have dedicated routes, and now they are a feeder network, and they operate as feeder networks and trunk routes to support the metro line. So because they want to encourage people to take the metro line from their origin to their destination, that's what they did to the bus system, and there's an integrated fare collection system also. And to us, when we look at this, we have patterns of behavior and travel mode choice that were happening earlier, and then we have a shock that happened in the system, Trans Santiago happened, and then we have the behavior of individuals and their mode choices over time. So to us, this could be a great opportunity to explore the impact of our model. So the Trans Santiago data, it has 4 one-week ways of travel diaries that spanned for 22 months, and it coincided with the Trans Santiago. We had 220 respondents that were full-time employees in one of the big campuses at a university in Santiago that were spread out on 6 different campuses. We had a total of 4,400 observations, and we were trying to understand their work trip commute during the AM peak. And the explanatory variables were the social demographics, age, gender, level of income, education, and the attributes of the work trips: travel time, travel cost, number of transfers, so on and so forth, and finally attitudes and perceptions, but they were only limited to the last wave. Quick EDA, or exploratory data analysis, on the data that we have. So again, we had 4 different waves, and we had 7 different aggregated alternatives. We had the car, metro, bus, walk, bike, drive to metro, and bus to metro. And the plot shows the mode choice shares in percentages across the four different waves. And Trans Santiago happened here. We can see that there's a big reduction in the mode choice for bus, and that is definitely aligned with the whole idea of Trans Santiago, because I want to encourage more people to use the metro. There's an increase in the share of the bus to metro users, and there's an increase in the share of the metro users. Now, so with that in mind, we started estimating the different models. And we first started, so the way that we estimated the model was we first only focused on the transition of modality styles being a function of social demographic variables, because we wanted to take advantage of the power of the EM algorithm, which made us estimate model parameters much faster in a few minutes. And so the way we think about those problems, I mean, we care about the stats, we care about the fit, the statistical fit, and we care about the behavior. And we first start with 2 different modality styles in the population in Santiago, and then we built on that to go into 3 modality styles and then 4. And here we displayed the final log likelihood, the number of parameters estimated in the model, and the rho bar squared AIC and the Bayesian information criterions. And to us, the 4th class model has good statistical fit. It had the lowest AIC and PIC, and a very decent rho bar squared compared with the 3 modality style case. And we were estimating 83 parameters, and that was the chosen model for us. I mean, we had 4 different classes of modality styles in the sample. And after we did that, then we added the feedback in the system to model the transition of modality styles over time to cater for the changes in the transportation network itself. Okay, so now we will walk through model results. We will first start discussing the class-specific choice model. The class-specific choice model here, we ended up identifying 4 different distinct market segments in the population. The drivers, the bus users, bus metro users, and the auto metro users. And if we have a look at the consideration set, we can see how different they are across the different market segments. Drivers, for example, they consider all the available modes of transportation, but when we did sample enumeration on this class, 75% of those trips were conducted via the car. So we gave them the labeled drivers. The bus users is a deterministic class. This group of people will only consider the bus when making a trip. And then we have the bus metro users. They consider the metro, bus, and bus metro. And finally, we have the auto metro users, and they consider the auto metro and the auto metro alternatives. And then we can see where the construct of modality style kicks in, that yes, people are different. They don't consider all alternatives when they make a mode choice decision. And let's have a look at the parameter estimates. And these are the parameter estimates coming from the class-specific choice model. Again, we have the 4 different classes: drivers, the bus users, bus metro users, and auto metro users. And we have the different variables in our model. We have the intercepts first, the alternative specific constants, and we have the travel time, walk time, travel cost, waiting time, and number of transfer. And to us, when we look at this and we try to interpret it, first of all, the parameters, they're significant. They are behaviorally consistent. They have the right sign. So to us, we can actually interpret the model. It makes sense. And when we can also look at the marginal rate of substitution between travel time and travel cost. So for example, we can quantify the value of time across the different 4 classes. And we can see that in terms of magnitude, drivers are maybe 6 to 7 times more, they value their time more than the remaining transit users, which kind of makes sense, right? Because I mean, people that are drivers that have a car that they own it, they're more likely to have a higher income, and hence their value of time is much higher. And then when we look at those parameter estimates, they're consistent, they're significant, and then to us, I mean, the story is there. It matches well. It matches what was happening in the system, and the market segments look decent to us. And we won't go over to go over the other parameter estimates from the initialization model and the transition model, the remaining 80 parameters. We actually conducted sample enumeration using those parameter estimates to see what happened with modality styles. I mean, is it the case, did actually modality styles change over time? That was the entire motivation earlier in my talk. I mean, modality styles are changing. Did they change, and if so, in what direction, and what happened there after Santiago? So this plot here shows the percentage of the population in the different market segments or in the different modality styles. We can see that we had 40% of the population belonging to the bus class, and then we had around 35%, 36% of the population being in the driver's class. And that happened 2 months before the introduction of Trans-Santiago, so the first time period. And then Trans-Santiago happened. And then when we use the transition probability model to look at the aggregate shares, this is the trend. So what do we see here? We see, I mean, 2 key things. First, there's a reduction in the share of the population that considered bus only, so the bus users. And then we see an increase in a bigger increase in the share of the bus metro users, and there's a slight increase in the share of drivers and a slight increase in the share of auto metro users. That's the first interesting thing. Second interesting thing is that once Trans-Santiago happened, we can see that between wave 1 and 2, so 2 months before and 3 months after, the biggest reduction and the biggest increases in those share of modality styles happen. And then those trends, those shifts in modality styles tend to stabilize over time because there's nothing else changing. And everything will be like somehow within a certain ballpark fixed, and then those trends are somehow fixed. I mean, they're somehow more constant. Okay, so now that we've estimated this fancy dynamic model, which was rooted in the behavioral theory, and the results and the parameters started to make sense, and the story was there. We wanted to compare this model to something else and use that model for policy analysis. So as we know, practitioners and policy analysts and transportation specialists, our focus is on aggregate shares. What's going to happen to the aggregate market share of driving, bus, new modes of transportation? So we wanted to see, is actually accounting for those dynamics of modality styles on the individual level will cause such bigger differences on the aggregate level, and if so, on the market shares, and what's going to happen? So that's why we wanted to compare our dynamic hidden Markov model with a static model. And the closest thing we could compare our dynamic model with is the latent class choice model. So for those of you that aren't familiar with them, they are similar to, they are mixture models from statistics, but again, the distributions are Loche distributions. In order to make the comparison super easy between not super easy, like consistent to a certain extent between the two models, we wanted to parameterize the class membership model of the latent class to entail the socioeconomic and demographic variables and the transportation system itself. This way, the class membership model of the latent class choice model would be similar to the transition probability model of the hidden Markov. And we estimated, we wanted to estimate that static model. So when we look at the data that we have, since it's a cross-sectional, the static models are estimated on cross-sectional data, we wanted to bound our estimates. So we estimated a latent class choice model at the first wave before Trans-Santiago, and then we estimated a latent class choice model at the fourth wave after Trans-Santiago and once people adapted to the new system. And there were two policy scenarios we were interested in. First, increasing household income by 10% for waves 5, 6, and 7 respectively, and then reducing travel time by 15% for the bus and bus to metro alternatives. And this particular shock to the transportation network is assumed to take place between the fourth wave and the fifth wave. So between wave 4 and wave 5, we perturb the system, there's a reduction in travel time, and then we're going to see what's going to happen with our forecasts. Okay. So these are the results, the plots from scenario 1, increasing household income at waves 5, 6, and 7. And we are comparing the results across the hidden Markov model, latent class choice model estimated at wave 1 with wave 1 observations, and the latent class choice model using the wave 4 observations. And we're trying to understand what happened to the population share across the 4 different modality styles that we had in our data. So for example, when we look at the latent class choice model for wave 1, we had it overestimated the share of drivers and overestimated the share of bus users and underestimated the share of the bus metro users in the population when we compare it with the hidden Markov model. And when we look at the latent class choice model estimated with wave 4 observations, you can see that it underestimates the share of drivers and it overestimates the share of bus users and bus metro users. However, when we look at those trends, we can see that the discrepancy between the Markov model and the latent class choice model at wave 4, the trend is there. They're somehow a bit more comparable as with respect to the latent class choice model in wave 1. And why do you think that happened? If you take a step back and think about the Trans-Santiago itself, at wave 1, we had more people using the bus, we had more people driving to work. While at wave 4, after people adapted to Trans-Santiago, we had more people using the bus metro and the metro alternatives. And then those discrepancies in the share of the modality styles in the population also exist. I mean, we also have those discrepancies when we look at the market shares for the different transportation modes, and we can see that discrepancies in the driving, drive to metro, the bus metro, or the bus metro alternatives, and the bike and walk. Again, we have discrepancies between the static framework and the dynamic framework. And similarly for scenario 2, which is reducing the travel time for the bus and bus metro alternatives, we can see that, again, the latent class choice model estimated at wave 1 overestimates the share of drivers, the bus users, and underestimates the share of bus metro users. And the similar scenario for wave 4, LCCM at wave 4, it underestimates the share of driver, and it overestimates the share of bus users and bus metro users. And finally, when we look at the market shares, again here, since our shock happened between wave 4 and wave 5, the market share predictions for the wave 5, 6, and 7 is going to be the same. So I'm only showing one plot for the market shares. That's for the hidden Markov latent class choice model for wave 1 and LCCM for wave 4. And again, we do have bigger discrepancies in the share of the bus to metro between the LCCM for wave 1 and the hidden Markov model. We have discrepancies also in the auto alternative, and we have bigger discrepancies in the bus alternative. And when we look and we compare the hidden Markov model with the LCCM that was estimated at wave 4, the discrepancies are definitely less, but however, there are significant differences. And when we think about it, what happened is, when you want to compare a static framework to a dynamic framework, the latent class choice model that was estimated at wave 1, it doesn't really model the changes in the system on behavior, because Trans-Santiago happened after it. When we go and we estimate the latent class choice model at wave 4, after Trans-Santiago happened, yes, the shock happened, the system changed. I am more able to understand the effects of changes in the system. However, such a model here will fail to estimate. There will be discrepancies between in terms of habit and inertia, because people are resistant to change. While with the hidden Markov model, it tries to estimate the path, the evolution of modality styles over time to cater for inertia and habit constructs and changes in the system and social demographics. And that's why we see the discrepancies between the different models. In conclusion with this piece of work, the whole idea was trends are important, dynamics of modality styles were the key driver for this project. And we can see a shock to the system, such as Trans-Santiago, did indeed force individuals to reconsider how they travel. There were changes in the choice set, there were changes in the value of time, in the sensitivities to travel time and travel cost. And to us, when we saw the comparison earlier, we did see much bigger differences on the individual level in terms of the dynamics and the evolution of modality styles. And even when we looked at an aggregate level, at the market share predictions, there were differences. And that's to us, when we look at all of those things, those dynamics of modality style and the dynamic framework will give us more realistic representations of how the future is going to look like in terms of ranking policies and investment strategies to make modality styles more sustainable and more multimodal and push people towards this sharing economy future we're talking about. Since we have some time, I'm going to talk about the other piece of work. It's a few minutes, 5 minutes, super brief. So the objective here was, car sharing, ride sharing is happening, and we already highlighted that limitation in the activity-based models, and then we wanted to define a quantitative method that could show us how could we project and understand what's going to happen with ride sharing and car sharing services. How can we develop a model that could show us what's going to happen to their market share? And the objective was to forecast and project membership for upcoming modes of transport under different investment strategies and under different scenarios. Again, what happens if we change or incur changes in the network design, or we have a marketing plan to support a new car sharing or ride sharing service, regulations, policies, and investment strategies. And all of these variables, they will change or perturb this black box behavior. And we are interested in modeling and understanding the behavior, the adoption behavior of people to those new modes of transportation. And once we do that, we can try to understand, do our what-if analysis. If we change something in the network design, what's going to happen? How will the adoption profile and how will the different modes of transportation diffuse in the market? The conceptual framework here for this project, so we have those different adoption styles that the diffusion literature focuses on. People are different. We're very different in terms of our behavior. There are 3 different types of adopters that are there in the diffusion literature across multiple disciplines, in economics and agriculture, all over the place. And there are 2 distinct differences between 2 different types of adopters, the innovators and the imitators. The innovators are the more daring chunk in the population. When they see a new product, a new technology, they want to go there and they're going to try it out, they want to buy and adopt. While the imitators, they're mostly influenced by their peers, with a social circle. There's a social influence component. If I see, for example, Joan buying a new car, I want to buy a new car. So there's that social influence component happening. And there's, again, the market segment of non-adopters. The non-adopters is the market segment that will never adopt the service. And we always condition on the social demographic and the transportation network level of service. And then the whole idea is people are different, adopters are different. I want to try to understand their adoption behavior. And how does the adoption behavior differ across market segments? And we wanted to understand and model the adoption behavior as a function of the attributes of the new technology. For example, the price, the fleet size, the supply side of new technology, the car sharing or ride sharing service, social demographics, social influences that will impact the imitators class, and network effect. And by network effect, we were interested in understanding when the network coverage gets bigger and bigger and bigger, how will that impact my adoption behavior? When I see that there's more coverage from a certain ride-sharing service, am I going to be more willing to join, yes or not? And if so, what is the impact? The proposed framework was, again, we were quantifying the network effect through developing a network effect model that seeks to understand how would the size of the network impact adoption. That will feed into our adoption behavior model. And then we are able, because we observe whether a certain person adopts or not, so now we can actually understand when I look at a certain person, what is the probability that that person will adopt a certain technology as a function of the network effect, social demographics, attributes of the new technology, and social influences. And again, we said earlier that there are 3 different market segments, of 3 different adoption styles. So all of these are conditioned on that person belonging to one of those market segments, whether the innovators, imitators, and non-adopters. And again, we adopted a dynamic latent class choice model, and then we integrated a network effect or destination choice model. And the data for this car sharing, the data comes from a one-way car sharing system. We had observations for 2.5 years, ever since the service was launched in a major city in the United States. We process our data on a month-to-month basis, and the whole idea of the car sharing service was, I leave my house, there's either a station of the car sharing service next to my house, I can turn on the car and drive, or there are on-street parking spots dedicated for that car sharing service. And we estimated our latent class choice model here, and when we looked at the parameter estimates, again, they were behaviorally consistent, they had the right sign, and they were statistically significant. Great. So second step was we wanted to validate our model. We wanted to see, is there a certain ballpark or range for our model? What happened is, again, we had 30 months worth of data. So we ended up estimating the model on 24 months, and then we calibrated our model on the 25th, and then we bootstrapped our forecast. So we wanted to develop confidence intervals on our forecasted adoption, and then see how would those compare with respect to the actual number of adopters in the system, and we were doing pretty well. Here, there were bigger discrepancies, and there was something happening in the system that our data doesn't cover. Great. Now that model estimation was done, we had a model that we were happy with from a behavior side and from a statistics side. We wanted to use that model to forecast adoption into the future. And we had different policies in mind that we wanted to play around with. One, how could investing in a station for that car sharing service in different locations play out in the future? Whether we invest in a car sharing station in downtown versus a technology firm. The second would be, how would we understand whether it's better to have an on-street parking facility for the car sharing service or a station, and which one of those would maximize the forecasted number of adopters? And finally, how would a collaboration with a major technology firm impact adoption? We can see this plot here. It identifies the cumulative number of adopters of the ride-sharing service. And then all of this part here until the red line, those were the 30 months of data that we had that was observed. And then the power of the model is trying to identify how would those forecasted number of adopters play out in the future, and which policy would maximize the forecasted number of adopters. And we can see having a collaboration with a major technology firm and having stations of the car sharing service outside a major technology firm will maximize the expected number of adopters. And there were no there were no big differences between having a station or on-street parking for a certain car sharing facility in downtown. And finally, we can see that the base case has a lower bound on the forecasted number of adopters. So many conclusions for this section. Again, so we talked about technology adoption. That's important. We want to forecast into the future. How will the market shares play out? We ended up estimating a latent class choice model. We were focusing on the behavior of 3 different market segments that are there in the population and that are rooted in the technology diffusion literature. Our model captures the effects of social demographics, social influences, and the network effects. And the results look promising in terms of their behavioral consistency, the sign, and the significance. And we use the model to forecast into the future to rank policies and investment strategies. Conclusions. The bigger picture now. Okay, way earlier in my talk, I highlighted that there's a need to understand and model and forecast the evolution of trends of travel behavior. And the fact that there were two key limitations in current activity-based travel demand models in understanding and predicting those trends of travel behavior. One, that we didn't have a mechanism for the diffusion, uptake, and decline of new technologies. And in my dissertation, we tried to account for this. As we said earlier, we had those adoption styles. We're modeling the adoption behavior over time. And then the second limitation was that there was no dynamic framework to understand and predict changes in lifestyles and in travel behavior. And this was the chunk of work that we focused most of this talk about. We tried to understand how will travel behavior and lifestyles change over time as a function of changes in the system and as a function of changes in social demographic variables. Future directions with this work would be fusing both models together, trying to understand how will modality styles actually impact adoption. I mean, if I have a driver's class and that driver's class is actually booming in the market, how would that even impact the adoption of car sharing and ride sharing services? Because these two constructs are connected to one another. And also, in the models we've seen that I've estimated in this dissertation, we don't explicitly account for the social norms. And all of the social norms are confounded with the alternative specific consent. And it will be interesting actually to cater for social norms when we want to estimate this integrated, dynamic, discrete choice framework. Final key takeaways from all this talk. What I want you guys just to have there in your mind by Feras. So, travel behavior is changing, lifestyles are going to change, modality styles are changing. We're trying to understand the changes in the system in a dynamic manner because we want to forecast better into the future. And we also went, in this dissertation, we focused on developing quantitative methods to forecast adoption into the future. The thing is, those two key methodologies are important from a policy perspective, from a planning perspective, from a transportation perspective. I mean, how could we guide this evolution of lifestyles and travel behavior to be more sustainable and multimodal? How can we prioritize, how can we rank effective policies and investment strategies at the public level and the private level to make those shifts in modality style to be more sustainable and multimodal and get to this envisioned sharing economy future that everyone is talking about? Finally, acknowledgements. It's going to be very quick. Acknowledgement, first I want to acknowledge my parents. Ultimate gratitude, and I'm very thankful for my parents for everything. You know, I'm not the easiest person in the world. And, thank you guys so much for everything. My brothers, they're the pillars for like the biggest support system that I have. My grandma, one of my biggest, literally my biggest fan, and my beautiful cousins that Shrita mentioned, Reina. And then, of course, my Rupa, she's always been there through the good times and the bad times. And childhood friends and best friends from back home. AUB friends that with all their brainwashing sessions for me to join the PhD and actually do it, because I was super hesitant about the PhD in the first place. And to the fantastic and phenomenal people I've met in Berkeley through my experience at Berkeley. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to the two clowns over here, Srita and Tim, for the good times, for all the laughs that we've had in 116, and to everyone in 116. I really thank you guys for everything, for all the support out there. And I also want to acknowledge Mark, Paul, and Max for their feedback during my calls and for their feedback during my dissertation workshop. And I also want to acknowledge the one and only Akshay Vich for his tremendous help throughout my first semester of the PhD. Tim is just, I dropped you out of the picture. This was in India. So I want to thank Vich because Vich drew me into this field of developing and writing algorithms, decent algorithms, and estimating models with the utmost efficiency. And Vich, thanks a lot for the great support throughout the HMM project that I was working on. And last but not least, my John Walker. Thank you, John. Thank you, John, for being a phenomenal advisor. Thanks for all the advice. I mean, research-wise, career-wise, on the personal life also. I mean, I consider myself I have a future colleague from now on after I get that signature. Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending. That's it. If you have anything. I'll be avoiding them in my question Q&A.
In your HMM framework, does the effect of a technology impact depend on there being a previous such intervention of technology. So I'm asking if there's a long-term dependence between models, because Markov just depends on the last stage.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. So in New Delhi, they introduced the bus rapid transit system.
Yeah.
And because it was implemented so badly, it got so much bad publicity that any future BRT project is viewed very negatively and people are very averse to adopting it. So is there any long-term impact of such?
So you're saying long-term impacts of a certain investment in the...
Yeah, is a future intervention dependent on a past intervention?
Explicitly not in the model, but implicitly it's happening in what sense? When you change, when I incur that change in the model, the modality style concept, those modality styles are going to change to account for the changes in the system. So they're already confounded with the transitions of modality styles over time. And then when the new shock happened, those changes have already happened because of the first change in the system. So it's implicit in the model because it's already, those changes have happened, not haphazardly, they've happened because there is a shock or something that has happened earlier. Yeah.
So in your dynamics model,
Yeah.
right, if I understand correctly, why do you have a dynamic parameters? So here you have a fixed parameter for all the time periods. So
Yeah.
to me, dynamics means the parameter also change over time.
So you're saying, did we estimate a dynamic parameter or did we
The
estimate?
dynamic parameter, why not dynamic parameter?
Yeah.
To capture
So
the-
yeah, that's a good question. Again, the whole idea and objective was to model and forecast. So we want to use the model to forecast. I could have estimated a heterogeneous hidden Markov model, where the parameters are a function of time. They change. So we have a set of parameters for the second, third, and fourth time period. But when you want to forecast into the future, which set of parameters will you use? You can either average them out and take an average and use it, but that's going to be somehow implicit in terms of using a homogeneous hidden model. It's going to be somehow similar to using an average parameter that is estimated from the data itself. Because in this case, which parameter estimate would I end up using? And that's why we ended up going to using the homogeneous hidden Markov model. Is it clear or?
Why not use the last time step parameter? Because parameter depends on time, right?
Yeah.
If you set an initial point,
Mhm.
and then you can set your timestamp and make prediction for beta first, and
Yeah.
then using that beta to predict your demand.
Yeah, but the thing is, in this case, you're assuming that the behavior for those people at later time periods is highly impacted by their behavior at the fourth time period. But wouldn't that overestimate or underestimate the behavior in future time periods? Because you're only relying on the parameter estimates from the fourth time period. That's why, we didn't want to resort to that fourth time period. We wanted to have somehow of an average effect that was more consistent with the population. Yeah.
So for Santiago, you had information about the first, the status quo, and then the shift, the Trans-Santiago shift,
Yeah.
the first wave, right?
We have information about the four waves.
Yeah, so you had information, right? So my question was, when you were when you trained your model on the four waves, did you have any test data from these four waves that you sort of tested your models on and got some out of box, more share estimates and
That's a good question. The thing is, let me show you. So ideally what I wanted to do was the way that we generated bootstrapped methods in the diffusion model. The idea here is that I only have 4 time periods. And if I want to train on 2 and maybe 3, and I want to have 1 to calibrate the model and then other time periods to forecast, so we couldn't lose so much data points from our model because we wanted to show Trans-Santiago happened between the first and second wave. So we wanted to see that shifts, trends have changed, the modality styles have changed, and we wanted to see that they've stabilized. So I couldn't afford removing more observations because if I had maybe 10 time periods, I would have trained on 8 and then use the 9 to calibrate as we did here, and then predict on the last time period if I had more time periods.
This might be a basic question, but when you were comparing the forecast of the hidden Markov model and the latent class model, there were discrepancies. How can you know how these, which one is more accurate? Because you're testing on hypothetical scenarios, right? How can you know which one is more accurate? And did you make this judgment?
Again, ideally, if we had more time periods, that would have been fantastic. But the thing is, even if you had more time periods, you're testing policies that do not even exist. I mean, I'm increasing household income and I'm changing the travel time. But the fact is that when we look at the prediction and the fit of the hidden Markov and the way that it's rooted in those dynamics literature and why dynamics is important to us, having this behavioral component of a model and having those dynamics there we have this assumption that we believe it's going to have a better prediction, long-term prediction. I mean, that's the assumption that we have.
And one of the
We
slides,
can wrap it up, Jean Marie.
one of the slides you were showing like the shock and like how the mode shares changed. Did it make sense to me why driving increased? Like if people are moving away from bus, they would like the public transit. I think like 67, slide 60s. But 67, 68, 67, 68. Yes, okay. Yeah. Okay, exactly.
Yeah.
Why like people are moving away from public transit, which is the bus? If you're gonna move up from public
Why
transit,
are you driving?
Why are you driving?
Yeah.
Go
The
on,
idea is that the thing is, I think what happened, the system changed so abruptly overnight, and no one knew about it. And then people that are there's like a habit construct, right? I'm used to taking the bus that passes by my house, and now the bus has a different route. Maybe I have to walk to the station, and it's going to take me more time to take the bus than the metro. So I'm like, oh no, I'm just going to drive. I mean, that's my interpretation of what might have happened, because the way the system was not appealing to a certain chunk of the population that they ended up just driving.
We'll have one last question from Tim.
Thank you. All right. So, two-part question. One, how can you crop me out of two photos?
What two photos? One photo?
The one with John. I was in
That's correct.
Okay. And secondly, you talked about how there's like robustness that you wanted to investigate with this model. And it seems that when I'm in a policy setting and I'm saying, hey, I want to know what's going to go on with, let's say, TNC companies, if I'm back in 2010 and I'm thinking TNCs might come on the scene, I have this issue that you mentioned of, do they go in the driving modality style in their choice set? Do they go in the multimodal choice set? Do they go where? And it seems like you have this huge combinatoric problem, depending on the number of classes of where they go. And if you misspecify this, all your predictions are like shot afterwards, where it doesn't work out. So I'm wondering, how do you deal with this sort of thing when predicting?
I mean, in this case nowadays at least, since we already have those ride-sharing, car-sharing services out there, when I collect this panel data, I can have a modality style that is maybe ride-sharing, car-sharing, or futuristic, and then this would be the class where, that would be highly influenced with the car-sharing and ride-sharing services. That's how I would do it nowadays, because I already have observations from those futuristic car-sharing services.
But when predicting what happens with new technology, that you haven't, because this is kind of like the whole point.
Exactly. Like in terms of future work for this work, I mean, what do we do then? Maybe I would my gut would say included in the multimodal users group, for example, not the drivers group. Yeah. But now I think we're more lucky because we have more data about at least the futuristic car sharing services.
Okay, so let's give it a